Some love stories begin with a glance across a crowded room. Some begin with a whispered hello. But this one began in the middle of a war, where bullets were louder than heartbeats, and survival meant forgetting how to feel. Yet somehow, in all that darkness, two souls found each other. And what happened next will stay with you long after this story ends. Her name was Nadia, 26 years old, with dark eyes that held the kind of sadness that comes not from one bad day, but from years of watching a beautiful world slowly fall apart. She was a nurse working in a field hospital, somewhere in the middle of a country that had forgotten the sound of peace. Every morning she woke up to the sound of distant explosions. Every night she went to sleep wondering if she would see the sunrise again. She had learned to stop dreaming. Dreams, she believed, were a luxury that war could not afford her. His name was Amir, a young soldier, 29, with broad shoulders and a quiet voice that felt strangely gentle for someone trained to fight. He had been brought into her hospital on a cold Tuesday evening with a shrapnel wound on his left side and a look in his eyes that told her he was just physically broken. He was a man carrying something far heavier than any weapon: guilt, grief, and the unbearable weight of things he had seen on the battlefield that no human being should ever have to witness. Nadia treated his wound with steady hands and a professional distance. She had learned that lesson early: never get attached. In a war zone, attachment was dangerous. People left, people disappeared, people died. So she kept her walls high, her words short, and her heart locked behind layers of exhaustion and routine. But Amir was different. Not because he was extraordinary in any obvious way. He didn't try to impress her. He didn't speak much. The first thing he said to her after she finished dressing his wound was simply, "Thank you for having warm hands." It was such a small thing, such a quietly human thing to say in the middle of all that destruction. And for reasons she could not explain, those 5 words cracked something open inside her chest that she had spent 3 years carefully sealing shut. The hospital was overcrowded and understaffed. Amir stayed for 2 weeks recovering, and in those 2 weeks, something slow and unexpected began to grow between them. Not fireworks, not grand gestures, just honesty. The raw, unfiltered kind that only seems to exist when people are living this close to the edge of life and death. They talked late into the nights when the generators hummed and the wards were quieter. He told her about his younger brother back home, who collected football cards and still believed the war would end before his birthday. She told him about the garden her mother used to grow, full of jasmine and mint, and how she sometimes closed her eyes during the worst moments just to smell that garden in her memory. They were 2 broken people, sitting together in the wreckage of a world falling apart, and somehow that was enough. Somehow that felt like the most real thing either of them had experienced in years. But war has a cruel habit of interrupting tenderness. On the 13th day of Amir's recovery, the hospital received news that his unit was being reassigned. He would have to leave the following morning. Nadia heard it from another nurse before she heard it from him, and she spent an hour pretending to organize supply cabinets just so she didn't have to face what she was feeling. Because she had promised herself she wouldn't feel this. She had promised herself she was smarter than this. When she finally walked into his room that evening, Amir was sitting up on the edge of the bed, already looking like a soldier again, back straight, jaw set, eyes carrying that familiar mix of duty and distance. But when he looked at her, something in that expression softened immediately. He had been waiting for her. "I have to leave tomorrow," he said quietly. "I know," she replied. There was a long silence between them. Not an uncomfortable one, the kind of silence that holds more meaning than most conversations ever manage to reach. Outside, somewhere far in the distance, there was the low rumble of artillery. Inside, between these 2 people, there was something fragile and fierce and completely impossible, and yet completely real. "I don't know how to do this," Amir said finally, and she understood exactly what he meant. Not the leaving, not the war. He meant this, whatever this was that had grown between them in 13 days, in late-night conversations, in warm hands on cold wounds, in jasmine gardens and football card brothers, and 2 people who had forgotten how to hope suddenly finding themselves dangerously close to doing it again. Nadia looked at him for a long moment. Then she sat down in the chair beside his bed, the same chair she had sat in every night for nearly 2 weeks, and she said something that would change everything. She said, "Then don't do it alone." And just like that, without any plan, without any promise the world could guarantee, they stepped into the most terrifying thing two people at war can ever choose. They chose each other. Stay with us, because what comes next is where this story truly begins, and trust us. You are not ready for what love looks like when it is tested by everything the world can throw at it. Nobody warns you about the specific kind of pain that comes from loving someone during a war. Not the poets, not the movies, not the people who lived through it and somehow found words afterward, because the truth is, there are no real words for it. There is only the feeling. A constant, quiet terror that lives somewhere between your heartbeat and your breathing, reminding you every single second that the person you love is somewhere out there in the chaos, and you have absolutely no control over what happens to them. Nadia learned this on the very first morning after Amir left. She woke up and reached for the routine that had always protected her. Check the supply list, review the overnight patient charts, drink the terrible hospital coffee that tasted like warm mud. But somewhere between the coffee and the charts, her eyes moved to the empty bed in room 4, and something inside her chest dropped like a stone into still water, sending ripples through every carefully built wall she had ever constructed around herself. He had left before sunrise. They had said their goodbyes the night before in the quiet hallway outside his room, and it had been both everything and nothing like what goodbyes should be. No dramatic tears, no grand declarations, just two people standing close enough to feel each other's warmth, with Amir pressing a small folded piece of paper into her hand and saying, "Read it when you need to remember that someone out there is thinking about you." She had not read it yet. She kept it folded inside the front pocket of her uniform, close to her heart, as if it were something sacred, as if opening it too soon might use up its power. 3 weeks passed. The hospital filled and emptied and filled again with wounded men and women who all blurred together after a while into a single continuous story of human suffering. Nadia worked her shifts with the same steady precision she always had, but something was different now. She noticed things she had unnoticed before, the way a soldier's face changed when he laughed at an unexpected joke, the small tenderness in the way a young fighter held a photograph of his family when he thought no one was watching, the particular exhaustion in the eyes of people who were still fighting, not because they believed in victory but because they simply had no idea what else to do. Amir had done that to her. He had cracked her open, and now light was getting in whether she wanted it or not. Letters began arriving. Short ones at first, just a few lines, written in Amir's careful, slightly uneven handwriting on whatever paper he could find. He wrote about the cold. He wrote about a dog that had adopted his unit and followed them everywhere with complete loyalty and zero understanding of danger. He wrote about looking up at the same sky she was under and finding that thought oddly comforting. He never wrote about the fighting. She understood why. She never asked. She wrote back. At first, her letters were practical, almost clinical updates about the hospital. Small news from the world they were both suspended in, but slowly, letter by letter, she began to write about other things. The jasmine garden, her mother's laugh, the dream she used to have before the war of studying medicine in a city with cobblestone streets and outdoor cafes. Things she had not allowed herself to speak out loud in years. Writing to him felt like practicing being alive again. Then, on a gray Wednesday morning, the letters stopped. 2 weeks of silence, then 3. The world did not pause for her worry. The wounded kept arriving. The shifts kept cycling. The terrible coffee kept being terrible. But inside Nadia something was slowly going cold. She told herself it was the mail system, unreliable at the best of times in a war zone. She told herself units got relocated and communication cut off all the time. She told herself 100 perfectly reasonable things, and she believed none of them. On the 22nd day of silence, she finally opened his letter, the one he had pressed into her hand on the night he left. She sat in the small supply room where no one would see her, unfolded the paper with hands that were slightly less steady than usual, and read. It said, "I have never been good at saying the important things out loud, so I am writing this before I go, so that if the distance gets loud and the silence gets heavy, you will have this to hold on to. You reminded me that I am still a person, Nadia, not a soldier, not a number, a person. Whatever happens, that is yours. You did that, and I will spend however long I have left being grateful for 13 days and warm hands and a garden full of jasmine that I have never seen but somehow feel like I already know." She read it 3 times, then she pressed it back against her chest, closed her eyes, and in the darkness behind her eyelids she did something she had not done in almost 4 years. She let herself cry, fully, without stopping it, without apologizing for it. Because sometimes the bravest thing a person can do in the middle of a war is feel something. But she had no idea, none at all, that the very next morning,
He was
something was
standing at
going
the
to walk
entrance
through
of the
the doors of
hospital
her
when she
hospital and
arrived for
shatter
her
every
morning shift.
expectation she had
Thinner,
quietly built
a
around
little
what
slower in
happened
the
next.
way he held himself, like someone who had recently relearned how to carry their own weight. There was a new scar running along his jaw that hadn't been there before. But his eyes were the same quiet, steady eyes that had looked at her across a hospital room and said thank you for having warm hands like it was the most natural thing in the world. Amir was alive. Nadia stopped walking. For a moment she forgot entirely how to be a person, forgot her name, her shift, the supply list, the terrible coffee, all of it. She just stood in the cold morning air and looked at this man who had spent 22 days being a silence she didn't know how to survive, and she felt something move through her that had no clean name. Relief. Rage. Joy. Grief. All of it at once, tangled together the way only the truest emotions ever are. He saw her. He didn't smile immediately. He just looked at her with that same quiet honesty he had always carried, the kind that never tried to perform anything, and he said, "The male system was terrible. I'm sorry." And she laughed. She actually laughed, this surprised, helpless, completely unguarded laugh that she hadn't heard come out of herself in years. And then she crossed the space between them, and she didn't care who was watching or what it looked like or whether it was the professional thing to do, because there are moments in life when the professional thing and the human thing are two entirely different paths, and choosing the human one is not weakness. It is courage. He stayed for 4 days. His unit had been given brief leave, and he had spent nearly all of it traveling to find her. When she asked him why make the journey, why not just wait, why risk the extra time, he said something she would carry with her for the rest of her life. He said, "Because I read somewhere that brave people run toward the things that matter to them. And I am trying very hard to be brave in the right ways." Those 4 days were the most honest days of Nadia's adult life. They talked about everything, their fears, their families, the specific nightmares that visited each of them in the dark hours before dawn, the question of what came after the war if the war ever actually ended, the terrifying and beautiful possibility that maybe, somehow, this strange impossible thing between them could survive beyond the conditions that created it. She told him about the girl she used to be before all of this. Ambitious, loud, impossibly optimistic, the kind of person who made plans 5 years in advance and genuinely believed they would come true. He told her about the version of himself that existed before he put on a uniform, a young man who wanted to be an architect, who sketched buildings in notebooks, who believed the most meaningful thing a person could do was create something that made people feel at home. They had both lost those versions of themselves somewhere along the road that had led them here. But sitting together in the quiet space of those 4 days, something remarkable began to happen. They started finding each other again, not the people they had been before the war, because those people were gone and the honest truth is they were never coming back. But new versions. Scarred and slower and infinitely more real. People who had survived something terrible and come out the other side not hardened, but somehow, incredibly, stubbornly, still soft. Still capable of jasmine gardens and warm hands and letters written by lamplight. On the last night before Amir had to return to his unit, they sat outside on the steps of the hospital under a sky that was, for one rare evening, completely quiet. No distant artillery. No engines. Just stars, clear and indifferent and beautiful in the way that things which have existed forever are beautiful, without trying, without needing to be seen. "Are you afraid?" she asked him. Not of the obvious things. He understood what she meant. "Every day," he said. "But I think that's what it means to have something worth protecting." She leaned her head against his shoulder. He didn't move. They stayed like that for a long time, two people who had found each other in the worst possible place at the worst possible time, holding on to something that had no guarantee, no roadmap, no promise beyond the single fragile one they were making right now simply by choosing not to let go. The war did not end that night. Wars rarely end on nights that feel significant. The world kept turning with all its brutality and all its beauty pressed impossibly close together, the way they always are when you're paying attention. But Nadia went back to work the next morning with something she hadn't carried in years. Not certainty. Not safety. Something far more powerful than either of those things. She went back with proof, real, lived, undeniable proof. That even in the darkest conditions the human heart can imagine, love does not disappear. It adapts. It finds cracks in the concrete and grows through them like the most stubborn, determined thing alive. She went back with his latest letter already in her pocket, written the night before, ending with the words, "I will keep writing. Keep reading. That's how we stay close." And she did. And he did. Through everything that came after, through more silence and more fear and more days that tested every ounce of strength they both had, they kept writing. They kept reading. They kept choosing over and over again, in every small way available to them, the simple radical act of remaining human in a world that kept asking them not to be. That is the whole story. And it is also the beginning of one. Because that is what love in the shadow of war looks like. Not perfect. Not painless. But real, so stubbornly, impossibly, beautifully real. And if this story moved something in you today, if it reminded you of something you needed to remember about love, about resilience, about the courage it takes to feel anything at all when the world makes feeling feel dangerous, then you already know why stories like this one matter. Subscribe. Stay close. Because we are just getting started. Short life lesson. Even in your darkest season, love is not a weakness. It is the bravest act of resistance you can offer a broken world. Choose to feel. Choose to stay human. That is how the light gets in.